However you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, your grateful host. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. And oh my gosh, I am so excited tonight. We are finally taking a journey through not only history and one might argue forbidden history, but arguably a deep psychological shared archetype of all of us, a desire for this mythic place called Atlantis, a sort of utopia where it's a society that is technologically advanced, psychologically, spiritually advanced. People live well. It's a well-balanced, functioning society, which goodness knows we can try a little bit harder these days to have. And I think that it calls out to us. And the question is, how real is that myth? And is there something to the actuality of its existence? And Marco M. Vigato tonight, he's the author of the Empires of Atlantis, will take us on that journey. So grab your boat paddles just in case we need to jump off board. But no, I don't think tonight's ship is going to be sinking. In fact, I think we'll be sailing tonight. So no life jackets required. Marco will take us through, and it'll be a really exciting time for all of us. And I look forward to your questions as we travel. And why am I not worried that we need lifeboats and that we'll be sinking? Because I have alien bean coffee, and you know how much I love my alien bean coffee, which is essential to my well-being. Hi, Travis. Hi, Mark. Hi, Maria. Hey, Charles. Welcome to the chat, everyone. So glad to see you here. Marco M. Vigato is now with us. Marco, welcome to Paranormal Now.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here with you on the show tonight.
Hey, yeah, thank you. I'm literally giddy. This is a subject that the first history report that I ever wrote was on Atlantis. And I had read, and somehow, my teacher let me write about Atlantis for, a history report about a civilization. And, at the time, I think one of the most popular books was the Charles Berlitz book, Atlantis, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Sure.
And I think that his book really helped to legitimize the alternative archaeological research. From that generation, we got later Graham Hancock, Michael Cremo, and others that decided to look at history from a different angle. Where did you start, Marco, in your journey towards this mythic thing called Atlantis?
Well, I've always had a very deep interest into ancient civilizations since a very early age. I had the opportunity of visiting probably hundreds of archaeological sites throughout the world, and coming into contact with the vestiges of ancient civilization. I think it's almost natural to start asking questions about where did these civilizations originate, where did they get their culture from, particularly when you're confronted with such incredible megalithic monuments like the Egyptian pyramids, sites like Tiwanaku, Baalbek, for instance. You're confronted with something that doesn't really fit within the canon of history, at least not the kind of history that we have all been taught in school. And that's where I started on these quests, really, for the origins of civilization. And I started really to get interested in the story of Atlantis, both the scientific Atlantis as well as the esoteric Atlantis, which sort of coexist also in my book.
Yeah. So the big question is, do you believe Atlantis was a real civilization?
Absolutely. So when you talk about Atlantis, really this is just a name for what I consider was a global seafaring culture of the last ice age. So we're really talking about this idea of a lost civilization that existed probably over 10,000 years ago towards the end of the last ice age, and then disappeared in a global cataclysm just around the time where Plato situates the sinking of Atlantis. So we're talking about 9,600 BC at the end of the Younger Dryas.
It's interesting that it's around the Younger Dryas incident, isn't it? There seems to be a number of worldwide events connected to that.
Absolutely. So, and I think it's a truly remarkable coincidence if you think, of course, that this can be called a coincidence that if Plato just made up the story, somehow miraculously he gives a date for the sinking and disappearance of Atlantis. We can calculate as 9,600 BC, which remarkably coincides with the end of the Younger Dryas. As it's been determined based on geological analysis, based on the latest scientific evidence. So we also have evidence from various fields of science that are in a way corroborating this idea or this account that a major cataclysm occurred towards the end of the last ice age, which I believe was actually responsible for the destruction of this global civilization.
Did Plato get everything right?
Well, Plato got some of the details of the story. However, Plato's story is a second-hand story of Atlantis, if you want. Plato himself states that...
Didn't it come from the Egyptians originally, or...?
That's correct. That's correct. And Plato states it very clearly in his dialogues that the source for his Atlantis story was Egyptian. He had actually first heard the story from his great-grandfather Solon, who had in turn got it from the Egyptian priests of Sais and Heliopolis. So the original of the story is Egyptian. And what is interesting is that Plato's account is by no means the only account of Atlantis. There are several ancient accounts, even though they may not call it Atlantis, but the basic elements of the story, they're still there. We can actually trace back with fairly good confidence the origins of the Atlantis story to some genuine Egyptian accounts, as have been found on the walls of the Temple of Edfu in Egypt. And we can be certain that similar accounts also existed at other temples. We've just not found them yet, or they have disappeared over the passing of time.
Yeah, how far back did those accounts go?
Well, the Edfu building texts are probably, let's say, one of the most important pre-Platonic sources on Atlantis. They were written on the walls of the Temple of Edfu in Upper Egypt during the Ptolemaic period. So we're talking around 300 BC. So rightly or more or less around the same time as Plato. However, there is evidence that these accounts were copied from much earlier sources. If one analyzes the style of the text, the choice of words, it's very clear that these were copies of much earlier text. That
so you're saying that, I'm sorry, Marco, so you're saying the transcription or translation perhaps of the Egyptian culture from something earlier would indicate that the cadence of how it was written, the phrasing, the choice of that indicates that it wasn't innately written by Egyptians from in their tongue, that it was a translation.
That indicates that the origin of the text must be traced back at least to the Old Kingdom. So we're talking about the third or mid-third millennium BC, time around 2400, 2300 BC. And that's based on stylistic consideration of the text. Now, these texts were constantly copied and transcribed. So what we have now on the walls of the Temple of Edfu is very likely a translation or a copy, a later redaction of a text whose origins must date back to the Old Kingdom period. And that contains an account which is remarkably similar to Plato's story of Atlantis, which is actually one of the earliest accounts that we have of Atlantis, or of this lost civilization that disappeared at the end of the last ice age.
Were the Atlanteans really an advanced civilization, one that we should look to for inspiration?
Well, I think that's one very fundamental question. So, when we think about Atlantean civilization in general, we have to think about a civilization that spanned thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, which is something
Oh
you
yeah.
also suggest in the book. Very often,
Hmm.
when people think of Atlantis, they almost immediately tend to focus on the disappearance or the sinking of Atlantis,
Hmm.
which was, of course, a point in time episode. But a civilization of the kind described by Plato, even if we don't engage in speculation about the level of technology that the Atlanteans may have possessed, but we just stick to Plato's narrative, we're still talking about a civilization that would certainly be considered far superior to any civilization of Greek or classical times. So,
Hmm.
maybe not necessarily comparable to our own civilization in terms of technological advancement, but certainly one of the most advanced civilizations of antiquity. And clearly, in order to get to that level of sophistication and development, they would have taken centuries, if not thousands of years of evolution. So, when we think about Atlantis, we have to think about a civilization that went through different cycles as well, also through periods of decadence. And the civilization, the Atlantean civilization described by Plato, can actually be considered a terminal Atlantean civilization. So Plato describes the Atlantean civilization of the latter days, in a way. So just the final moments of Atlantean civilization. And that's something interesting that few people realize about Plato's account is that Plato does not idealize Atlantis in any way. Atlantis is not a sort of utopia in Plato's
Hmm.
account. Quite the opposite, actually. Atlantis is an example or a paradigm of how even the mightiest and most powerful empire that the world had ever seen could fall
Yeah.
prey to corruption and decadence that would eventually lead to its downfall.
Yeah, it's funny how it's interesting how it takes on that mythos. You know, when people hear the word Atlantis, there's this conjures this imagery of this, apex of
Mhm.
civilization, and yet it's really sort of a morality tale.
Mhm.
It's warning us, right?
And I think it's mostly a warning, which again is probably very relevant to our own society against the
Hmm.
danger of materialism. Because Plato says it very clearly that for anyone who didn't have eyes for truth,
Hmm.
Atlantis would have appeared as the most wonderful and the mightiest civilization ever seen. They were powerful, they were wealthy. However,
Hmm.
when you looked at the spirituality of the Atlanteans, they clearly went through a process of decadence and corruption. So that as Atlantean civilization lost somehow or became increasingly detached from its spiritual origins, it clearly grew in wealth, in material wealth, but lost much of its spiritual values, and that was ultimately, at least according to Plato, the cause of the downfall of Atlantis, like a
What what
disconnect.
what was so spiritual, highly spiritual about them
Well,
at one point?
one of the core ideas about Atlantis that we find in Plato, and if we find it also in the Western esoteric tradition, is this idea that Atlantean civilization was sort of divinely inspired civilization. It was truly a civilization of the gods. Even in Plato's account, there is this idea that Atlantean civilization was quite literally founded by the gods, and that the first Atlanteans were truly human divine hybrids. They shared the same, well, we would say, probably modern terms, the DNA of the gods in a
Hmm.
way. They were highly spiritual beings, but throughout the course of subsequent generations, as Plato says, the human element, the material element, took the upper hand, and that's what caused a gradual degradation of that original spiritual element. So, in a way, the story of Atlantis can also be seen as a representation of the fall of man from an original divine or semi-divine state into corruption and materialism.
Did their technology have anything to do with their spirituality?
Well, in a way, and that's, I think, one of the paradoxes and something that I try to explain also in the book. I think at the same time as the Atlanteans were becoming increasingly detached from their spiritual origins, they also lost access, and this is at least according to a certain esoteric tradition, to certain powers or faculties that were in a way innate in them because of their spiritual origin. So they had, in a way, to compensate with technology for the loss of these faculties. There's a
And
very
what do we
strong.
mean? Oh, go ahead, Mark.
There's a very strong suggestion, particularly in the esoteric tradition of the likes of Rudolf Steiner, for instance, and Theosophy, that the Atlanteans and all their science and technology was actually based on the mastery of what these philosophers call the life force, which was based on a direct connection with nature and with some of the basic energies of the universe. But as this connection was broken, they had to make increasing use of technology in order to compensate for that. So Atlantean technology, in a way, arose to compensate for the loss of some of the spiritual faculties of the primeval Atlanteans.
Is is there technology that we could possibly uncover from them? Is there something that we can look for? Is there evidence enough to say, hey, look for these signs for their technology?
I do think so, and I do believe that there have been, and maybe there still are, attempts at back engineering some of that technology. Clearly, Atlantean civilization at some point developed a very advanced form of technology that, in some respects, maybe not all, but in some respects, maybe comparable or even superior to our own technology. It was very based on different principles than our own technology. It was pretty less of a mechanical technology, much more of an energetic technology based on vibration, based on harnessing some basic energies like geomagnetic energy, for instance. So it was based on different principles, but at the same time, I do believe that it is at least theoretically possible to rediscover and even harness some of that technology.
Yeah, we today harness nature, right? So we have thermal energy, um, geothermal energy that we can produce, but even that for us it requires some electronics, wires, plastics. So how does one harness earth technology, earth energies, without the materials that we
Yeah.
have?
I think that our technology, since the time of the Industrial Revolution, but maybe even earlier than that, went down the path of mechanical technology. So our technology is essentially mechanical technology, uses like
A train,
mechanics.
fossil fuel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So basically, like uses like mechanical power, mechanical energy.
Mhm.
However, and they, of course, like it's hard to think about that from our frame of reference, but it's entirely possible. And actually, if you look at many ancient descriptions of what that science, what that technology was based on, and we can actually think of a type of technologies based on entirely different principles, on
Mhm.
energy, on vibration, for instance. Particularly around vibration, there is evidence that some forms of vibration, even acoustics, were employed to perform feats of architecture and engineering, like the lifting of huge masses of stone, the melting and vitrification of rock, which were performed by non-mechanical means. And again, I do not claim an understanding of the principles on which this science and technology was based, but we have the evidence in the form of artifacts, in the form of incredible works of engineering that were realized at that time based on technologies and principles that we do not presently understand.
Marco, what is it that you think you see and other alternative researchers see that the mainstream doesn't, because there are a lot of smart people out there that are looking at this, and many are saying, no, it was just a myth. It was just a story to tell to teach people some lesson. Why aren't there so many smart people that believe that, and then others like yourself that are more rogue in their interpretation?
I think it's a matter of paradigm shift, right? So in pretty much every scientific discipline, and particularly in one as conservative as archaeology, always takes time before a change of paradigm can take shape.
Sure.
If you think of what is the structure also of scientific revolutions, it always goes about ordinary science and revolutionary science. So ordinary science is the process by which you just keep adding little by little to the existing knowledge. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of really brilliant researchers that do just that. They focus on specific aspects of ancient civilization. They constantly increase, very often like in a very gradual way, our body of knowledge about antiquity. But then on the other hand, there is also what is called revolutionary science that challenges the existing paradigm. And that I think what is missing in the academic view of history of the past is really an ability to connect the dots. So right now, science and academia has been pushing in the direction of greater and greater specialization. So now we have specialists in Egyptian archaeologists, Mesopotamian archaeologists. And even within that, you have archaeology just focused on a specific time period and a specific style of ceramics, for instance. But what you're missing with that is an ability to see the broader picture of civilization across continents, across different time periods. And that's where I think alternative researchers or independent researchers can really play a role in connecting the dots, bringing together different disciplines from archaeology to geology, astronomy, mythology as well, in order to create a comprehensive view of the origins of civilization.
So that's the category you would put yourself in, independent researcher.
That's correct. That's at least the way I see myself. I don't see myself as an academic, but I see myself as someone who uses the scientific method to piece together the evidence and formulate a theory, a hypothesis that is, of course, falsifiable. And can be put to the test of the facts. I think as any scientific hypothesis or theory, even that of Atlantis or the former existence of a technologically advanced civilization, is something that needs to be tested on the ground with evidence. So much of my work, much of my research is actually focused on uncovering the evidence for that ancient lost civilization.
And what does it require to actually uncover the evidence?
I think we're at a very unique point in time in human history when, for the first time, we have not only the technology but also the access to sites around the world. The body of knowledge that's been generated over the last 2 centuries on archaeological sites is enormous, and it's something that has never been available at any other time in the course of human history. So I truly think we're at a unique moment for that paradigm shift to take place within the field of archaeology. And I do see several cracks already starting to open within the existing paradigm. Just think about a site like Göbekli Tepe, for instance, which was entirely unknown up until no more than 20 years ago, which is quite literally nothing within the course of human history, and within the frame of modern science. Just think about all the changes that this discovery has brought to our understanding of prehistory, and think how many more sites like Göbekli Tepe, maybe even more advanced sites than Göbekli Tepe, still await discovery. And with every new discovery, we're constantly pushing back the origins of human civilization, also changing our perception of how advanced, how sophisticated these early human cultures were.
Oh yeah, no doubt. That's everything from paleontology to archaeology. We're learning so much about the human history, and our concepts of what our ancestors were. We're very limited and are expanding. And you're right; it's a slow process, but it does seem that scientists, will come around
Yeah,
eventually. Are you going out there and getting your hands dirty?
I
And
am. I
you are,
am.
yeah.
Actually, that's a big part of my work, and also the way I see myself, not only as a
Hmm.
researcher and author, but also really as a field researcher and an explorer as well. So
Hmm.
much of my work has to do with uncovering the physical evidence for ancient advanced
Sure.
civilizations. So, I've been now living in Mexico for the past 7 years. And
Hmm.
during this time, I've been actively involved in a number of archaeological projects through my own foundation. I've been directly sponsoring and funding archaeological research at sites that may hold clues to this whole lost civilization. And I think that's the approach that we need to follow if we really want to
Yeah, yeah.
uncover that kind of evidence, because I do believe that the evidence is out there, or just nobody has been looking for it. And so,
Okay, Marco, let's hold it right there. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging with us for the first half hour. We have an hour and a half to go with this fantastic guest. We will be discussing all things Atlantis. And of course, I'll have to ask Marco about Lemuria and Mu as well, and all ancient civilizations. Were they all connected? So much to cover tonight. I'm really excited. Thank you all for participating. I look forward to your comments on YouTube. If you enjoy this show and other shows on the Mystic Lounge YouTube channel, please like, comment down below, and most definitely subscribe, because I really appreciate that support to help keep this channel growing. And, we can add more content as we go along. All right. I will see you on the inverted upside down.
Hearts race to fight the future. Convinced of efforts to deceive.
This coffee is delicious. Is that a UFO? I'm actually seeing a UFO. This coffee is awesome. That's why they call it alien coffee bean. Is this even made on Earth? Hey all, Paranormal Now will be syndicated on the ARX Network, the new mainstream, where you can find your favorite hosts and shows on the cutting edge of ufological and paranormal news and topics. Listen for Paranormal Now rebroadcast on the X at 2 a.m. EST Fridays, 11 p.m. PST Thursdays at unxnetwork.com.
Got my own light, and it is burned bright. Till you took it in the middle of a winter night. My feelings so bright, will not lose light. If you kiss me on the lips and we both glow.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. You're listening on the Mystic Lounge YouTube channel, live rebroadcast Fridays, 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on the UNX Network. Taking us out of the break was music by Septembrio. If you enjoy Septembrio's music, which you will hear for the remainder of this evening, you can go to Septembrio, spelled with a y.com, or just jump onto iTunes or wherever you get your music. And Marco, I have to ask you this because I really do appreciate the listeners and the people in the comment section. So Alexi is curious about your accent and where that's from, because she believes it is
Sure.
indeed a sexy accent.
Well, thank you. I'm originally from Italy.
Okay, there you have
I
it,
was
Alexa.
born and grown up in Italy, but I have been living in Mexico for the past 7 years now. So you probably get a little bit of a Spanish accent mixed in there as well.
Fantastic. All right. And so, how long are you going to be down in Mexico for?
For about 6 years.
For 6 years. Okay.
Mhm.
And if there's somewhere else on this earth where you could, set up camp and be happy and also study Atlantis, where would it be?
Well, I think Mexico is probably the best place to do
Mhm.
that. Actually, I've been focusing most of my research for the past years on megalithic sites around Mexico, around Mesoamerica. I'm actually working on a second book describing some of my discoveries in the region, some of which I do believe are directly connected with Atlantis, or with this idea of a lost global civilization of prehistoric antiquity.
Right. So, how big was this civilization?
I think that's another great question, because many people, when they think about Atlantis, they tend to think about a sort of like little island with Greek-style temples that
Mhm.
sunk and disappeared into the ocean thousands of years ago. However, if we look at both at Plato's description, but also at various ancient traditions of Atlantis around the world, what they describe is a global seafaring culture. So that civilization, it certainly had center or heartland in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, but at some point it also established colonies and the outposts in various parts of the world. Plato himself, when he talks about Atlantis and the Atlantean Empire, talks about the war that was waged by the Atlanteans against the people living within the Pillars of Hercules, and how the Atlanteans occupied most of Europe and up to Italy and most of North Africa, including Egypt. And so the description that Plato provides is very much is very much that of colonial empire almost. Also the fact that you find the traditions related to Atlantis, or the idea of a lost ancient advanced civilization on both sides of the Atlantic, from Egypt to South America, Central America, Northern Europe. That is evidence itself of the fact that Atlantean civilization at some point spread to both sides of the Atlantic.
Right. So, is Atlantis the same thing as Lemuria?
No, it's not. These are different civilizations. Also, you have to go back to the esoteric tradition to find descriptions of Lemuria. That's a concept that was introduced mostly by theosophy during the late 1800s and early 1900s. It started off from the field of geology, when the first studies of the ocean seafloor were conducted that suggested a possible former existence of now submerged continental landmasses in the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. And actually, according to esoteric tradition, Lemuria represented the civilization immediately before Atlantis. So you find a sequence of different prehistoric cultures and prehistoric civilizations, in which, again, according to the esoteric tradition, the first was Hyperborea, that was located in the far north and preoccupied a polar region. Then followed Lemuria. There was the second great civilization, the second great continent that sunk, that was located in the Pacific Ocean, but also extended in parts of the Indian Ocean as far as Africa. And then you have Atlantis. There was the civilization of the last golden age immediately before our own. So you have a sequence of of multiple civilizations. So we tend to focus, of course, on Atlantis because that's the most recent in time, the one that is probably closest to us as the civilization of the last golden age. But there are probably even earlier civilizations, even before Atlantis itself, and Lemuria may have been one of those.
So it's chronologically, it's the closest to us.
Correct.
So it's Atlantis is not like a commonwealth of Lemuria.
No. Well, at least that's. And again, when we talk about Lemuria, we are entirely within the realm of the Western esoteric tradition. There are no ancient sources like Plato that talk about Lemuria. So it lives entirely within the frame of reference of the Western esoteric tradition. And according to the model, at least it was developed by Theosophy, by a number of other like esoteric and mystery schools, Lemuria represented the civilization of the humanity or the root race, to use the language of Theosophy, that existed before Atlantean humanity.
I see. Charles Smart in YouTube comment says, everything I know about Atlantis I got from Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius
Yes, great book.
1882. Right. So what was the first book that you read?
Not Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, really. I think I started to get mostly interest in the question of Atlantis, honestly, by reading Graham Hancock. I think Graham Hancock, with Fingerprints of the Gods, did an incredible job to resurrect, in a way, this whole idea of a lost advanced civilization. But this is by no means a new idea. Of course, like most of the arguments that Graham Hancock brought forth were new arguments. But this whole idea of Atlantis as the civilization of the last golden age was first put forth by Ignatius Donnelly. In a way, Ignatius Donnelly is the father of modern Atlantology, and is the first one that made a set of connections between Atlantis, global flood stories, myths from around the world that talk about these advanced civilization that was destroyed and perished in the cataclysm. There are a number of suggestions in Ignatius Donnelly's book that are remarkably ahead of his time, like the suggestion that Atlantis was destroyed by a comet, for instance, which is something that has not really been has not really become part of the mainstream until probably just a few years or less than a decade ago, with this whole Younger Dryas hypothesis now is providing scientific backing and scientific evidence for the idea that a cometary impact at the end of the last ice age may have been responsible for all these world traditions about the global flood and the sinking and destruction of Atlantis. So there are many ideas in Ignatius Donnelly's book that are really foundational to modern Atlantology. Yeah,
the Younger Dryas theory is overlaid over many events that we have studied throughout history, and anomalies. I mean, I think one of them I heard were some of the stones in Machu Picchu, or in Peru, where the stones almost look like they're kind of melted together.
Interlocking,
and but smooth, right, and curved. So not a angular, not a rectangular interlocking, right? It's almost as if they were heated and kind of compressed together. And one of the explanations I've heard is that the Younger Dryas, that explosion, created a sort of like a microwave event.
Well, I do think that we may find evidence, even at archaeological sites, of direct damage that was caused by earthquakes and by cataclysm may have been associated, if not with the Younger Dryas impact itself, at least with some other cosmic impacts or cosmic events. However, when we talk specifically about the polygonal masonry of Peru, I think there was quite clearly a deliberate process by which they created these walls with interlocking stones. I think it goes back to what I was mentioning in terms of Atlantean technology, or the technology that this civilization may have possessed, that's based on principles that are quite different from the ones upon which our modern mechanical science is based. So if we believe that this civilization possessed some sort of energy technology that was capable of softening, of melting, vitrifying the stone, that's exactly the type of marks that you find in places like Sacsayhuaman, near Cusco, for instance, at Machu Picchu, where you find stones that appear to have been almost molded or vitrified, as if the stone was in a sort of plastic state in a way. And there is no known method or technology, even today, that could quite literally melt or vitrify stone like andesite or granite.
Sure. We have another question from Charles. Does Marco look into Atlantis as the source for the megalithic yard?
Yes. Actually, when you look at ancient metrology, and I could probably talk for hours about this question of ancient metrology, but I do think this is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in favor of the former existence of a scientifically advanced civilization. When you think about the legacy and the relics of this civilization, we always tend to think about the great monuments like the pyramids, the megalithic structure they could have left behind. But also when we analyze the metrological system, like the units of measurement that were used, the mathematical proportions that were incorporated in this structure, that we realize that we are actually confronted with a global civilization. It's not only the megalithic yard, which of course was used at most megalithic sites in Western Europe on the European Atlantic seaboard, but it's possible to demonstrate the megalithic yard was related to other units of measurement employed throughout the ancient world, like the royal cubit, for instance, was employed in Egypt. Various types of feet, like the Roman feet, the Minoan feet, they were employed throughout the Mediterranean, but it may even be related to units of measurement employed in Mesoamerica, like the Hunab, which was employed by the builders of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. So when you can demonstrate all these different units of measurement were somehow connected almost as a part of an ancient metric system, and when you can also show that the same system of geometric and harmonic proportion that ruled architecture and construction were shared across continents, really, I think that's a very persuasive, very strong argument for the former existence of a scientific and technologically advanced civilization whose legacy then lived on also in some of these that are called scientific relics in a way. One of those being, of course, the metrological system. But if you also think of things that we just take for granted, like why we measure time and geographical coordinates, for instance, in minutes and seconds, using the sexagesimal system instead of the decimal system, they will apply for pretty much everything else. Our own way of measuring time, the calendar, the zodiac, all of these great inventions, in a way, we can trace back to very remote antiquity. And the fact that we find all of these on different continents among cultures and civilization that allegedly never had direct contact with each other, to me is very strong evidence that this was a legacy from a much older civilization.
Yeah, I mean, they almost got it right. As an American, I really wish we had a universal measuring system. Um, being married to a European, I'm quite enlightened on how absurd it is that America is so stubborn about our system of measurement. It gets frustrating, when you're going from country to country and you're converting metrics. If Atlantis did not self-implode, what do you think, our world would be like today?
Well, I do think that even Atlantean civilization, in a way, went through different cycles. So Part of what I suggest in the book is that we still live in a post-Atlantean period. If we take not only our restricted time frame of history as pretty much limited to the past 5,000 years, but if we really take a broader view of human existence on Earth, we now know that anatomically modern humans have existed for well over 200,000 years, probably even more than that, maybe even up to 400,000 years. So what we really know as history is only a very, very small percentage of the total of human existence. Even if we situate Atlantis as the civilization of the last golden age at around 10,000 years ago, we realize that our own civilization is basically little more than a postscript on Atlantean civilization. In a way, our civilization is a direct continuation of Atlantean civilization. It's maybe just an artificial separation that we have created, or that the cataclysm at the end of the last ice age has created, that makes us perceive a separation that in reality doesn't really exist. I do think that in many ways our own civilization is a direct continuation of Atlantean civilization. And the reason why I do believe that is that if we look back at the origin of the cultures of the historical period, Sumerian civilization, Egyptian civilization, Mesoamerican civilization, you can find that this civilization all trace their origins directly back into the mythical past, to Atlantis or to some civilization of the gods that existed in remote antiquity. They consider themselves to be the direct descendants of that civilization. So in a way, we can follow this same thread down to our own modern time as, in a way, the direct descendants, maybe not only the cultural, but also the genetic descendants of Atlanteans.
If the Egyptians were descendants of the Atlanteans, and you believe that the Great Pyramid of Giza is 10,000 roughly years old, then how do we explain the graffiti, or whatever you want to call it, of Khufu
Yep.
in that pyramid that archaeologists use as proof to say, hey, this person is stamping. Good.
Well, there have been arguments against the authenticity of those graffiti. So there is a theory that those graffiti in the upper relief chambers of the Great Pyramid, they were actually forged by Howard Weiss in the late 1800s. So I've never seen those graffiti myself because they are in an off-limits area of the pyramid, so I cannot judge for myself. But I do believe that the Egyptological argument for their authenticity is a pretty strong one. There are literally hundreds of graffiti. Many of those are upside down, so it would have taken a really major forgery. We're not just talking about a little cartouche or a little graffiti, or literally hundreds of those in those chambers. Now, the view that I have formed of the construction of the Great Pyramid, I've written an article about that, is one of a construction that progressed in stages. So what I suggest was actually started during the Neo-Atlantean period at Giza was probably just the foundations of these monuments. There is actually evidence that the Great Pyramid was left unfinished at that time. The construction probably only progressed up to the level of the 30th course of masonry, and that's where you find a discontinuity, like a very marked difference in the height of the courses and the quality of construction above that. There's almost a suggestion that the construction was started during Atlantean or Neo-Atlantean times, but then it was completed probably thousands of years later by the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So in my mind, there is no doubt that the dynastic Egyptians, they clearly worked on the Giza complex, but what they suggest is they simply finished or completed something that had been started already thousands of years earlier.
Do we not have any technology now for radiocarbon dating the stones? Is it impossible to know, when they were placed?
Well, there are a number of methods. When you're talking about radiocarbon dates, that is helpful to date organic remains, and there is very little organic material that can be dated within the pyramids. There has been some dates taken from samples of wood inside the pyramid, but of course we cannot be certain if that wood was inserted at the time of construction or at a later period. And even so, it's interesting that those samples yielded dates are actually earlier than the supposed date of reign of King Khufu in the fourth dynasty of the Old Kingdom. So the conventional date for the construction of the Great Pyramid situates it around 2400 BC at the time of King Khufu. However, those samples of wood that were dated from inside the Great Pyramid have been dated to 3100 BC, which again is not, we're not talking about 10,000 BC, but is still earlier than the accepted time frame of Egyptian history. There are, however, methods for dating, if not the stone itself, at least when a stone surface was last exposed to direct sunlight at the quarry. It's called optically stimulated luminescence, and it's a method that's been employed at a number of megalithic structures, including at Giza, with mixed results. Not all the dates have been published and have been released, but those, and quite curiously, no samples have been taken from the Great Pyramid. The only samples that were taken and dated were from the Third Pyramid, from the Menkore Pyramid, and from the Valley Temple, and these also yielded anomalous early dates around the 4th millennium BC. So again, earlier than the accepted timeline of Egyptian history. Again, we're not talking about 10,000 years old, but we're still talking about a time frame earlier than that of the Egyptian dynastic period. So I think in a way this confirms this idea that the pyramids, rather than having been built just at one point in time, were in fact continually expanded over perhaps the course of centuries or even thousands of years. And I do believe that the megalithic foundations of the Giza complex were probably laid around 10,000 years ago, but then construction progressed in different stages throughout much of the pre-dynastic and dynastic period of Egyptian civilization.
If that's true, then wouldn't there be evidence of a variation in erosion of the different layers over time?
There would be if the casing, like the outside casing of the pyramids, had been preserved.
Continually preserved generation to generation, protecting the outer layer of the stone.
Right, because what we see is by just the core masonry of the pyramid. First of all, we don't know if the construction had progressed enough that the pyramids had been like already cased in stone back then in a way that allows us to measure the rate of erosion. But there have been studies conducted. One particularly brilliant researcher, Ralph Ellis, has conducted research on the rate of erosion of the casing stones that are located very near the base of the Great Pyramid. And it is possible to measure what is the level of erosion on the stones themselves as opposed to the pavement, right? So you have a pavement and you have to assume that this pavement was constantly exposed to erosion, and then you have the casing stones themselves. And so if you measure by how much the pavement got eroded compared to the surface that was protected underneath the casing stones, and knowing what is the rate of erosion of limestone, you can calculate how much time would have taken to erode the pavement down to a depth of over 30 centimeters. So running, and of course, like this is not an exact science, but according to these calculations, the pavement must have been subject to thousands and thousands of years of erosion, probably close to 8,000 or more years of erosion. That's also very similar to the argument that's been proposed by the like of Robert Schoch, for instance, for the dating of the Sphinx based on water erosion. In that case, we suggest that the Sphinx must have existed at a time when the weather, the climate in Egypt was much more rainy, much more wet than it is today, so that the body of the Sphinx was deeply eroded by torrential rains and torrential downpours during what is called the Green Sahara period, basically when the Sahara did not really exist as a desert, but was a very verdant valley with rivers and lakes, a very different climate from today. And this is a question that has direct implications on the age of the pyramids themselves, because you cannot really separate the Sphinx from the pyramids. There is evidence that the foundation courses of at least the second pyramid, the Khafre pyramid, were built with enormous megalithic stone blocks that were extracted from the Sphinx enclosure. So that shows that the carving of the Sphinx and the construction of the first layers of the second pyramid must be contemporary. So if the Sphinx is dated to 8,000 or 9,000 BC, as suggested by Robert Schoch, based on geological evidence and the rate of erosion, that implies that also the first courses of the second pyramid must date to the same time, because these stone blocks were extracted directly from the Sphinx pressing. They must be contemporary with the carving of the Sphinx. And that's, again, I think, further evidence in favor of the idea that at least the foundation courses of the pyramids were laid at that very remote time period.
So you said if. I mean, are you saying there needs to be more scientific testing?
Well, it's a matter of at some point, I think the positions of different geologists and archaeologists, they get like very, very entrenched, right? So on the one hand, you have geologists like Robert Schoch that say that the Sphinx shows what they think is undisputable evidence of water erosion that can only have been produced over the course of thousands of years in pre-dynastic times. But then you have others, mostly in the Egyptological field, like Mark Lehner, for instance, suggest that even deny that what they're seeing is water erosion. They suggest it is only sand erosion. So there is a deep, let's say, a difference of opinion as to what could have caused that. And I think that's a question that is very hard and very difficult to settle. Every time we talk about the age of these monuments, and we're not only talking about the age of the pyramids or the Sphinx, but also other megalithic monuments like Tiwanaku, like the ruins of Peru and Bolivia, for instance, you're faced with very similar questions. I think right now it's extremely difficult to date this structure with certainty, and so long as we're unable to assign to this structure certain dates, or so long as debate exists between different fields of geologists, Egyptologists, around the dating of this structure, it's going to be like really hard to find a smoking gun that really points to an exact date.
Sure, there's so many variables, and time is the biggest variable.
There's a huge margin of uncertainty.
Yes, and I think that you made a really good point comparing sand erosion versus the water erosion. The sand erosion isn't an absolute, therefore it's not proven to be, a fact, and therefore it doesn't negate the hypothesis of the water erosion.
Right. It's based on so many assumptions. The reality is that both certainly happen. So you have a mix of water erosion and sand erosion as well. So both certainly contributed to the erosion of the Sphinx. But of course, there is uncertainty as to the rate of erosion. There is uncertainty even as to the hardness of the different strata that form the Sphinx. So if you look at the Sphinx, what you realize is that the head is remarkably much better preserved than the body of the Sphinx. The body of the Sphinx actually shows some very deep trenches that were caused by erosion over thousands of years. Some of these were already repaired during Old Kingdom times. So you have stonework, you have blockwork on the pose on the body of the Sphinx that was built during the Egyptian Old Kingdom, probably to repair an already heavily eroded surface. And this fact that the head of the Sphinx appears to be so much fresher, so much newer, may actually suggest the head of the Sphinx was recarved. If you also look at the proportions of the body, this is one of the other arguments that have been put forth to suggest an earlier origin of the Sphinx. It's quite disproportionate. You have this very small head with a very large body. So various authors like Robert Temple, Bob Neeland, more recently have suggested that the Sphinx was originally carved in the shape of a lion and then was recarved during early dynastic times with the head that we see today, which explains the different rate of erosion.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the Egyptians accentuated the human head, right? They admired a larger skull frame, and in the carving, if you're going to kind of create this edifice, why wouldn't it be a bigger head? Why would it be kind of a shrunken head? It doesn't seem to make sense for society that revered a larger skull.
Well, if you listen to mainstream Egyptologists, then the explanation they would provide is that that's a rock that they had, basically. So that the rock was shaped in such a way they could not carve a bigger head. But
I don't believe that because for such a sophisticated and technologically advanced society, and one clearly with resources, I'm sure they could have found a better rock if they wanted to, or just carved it, more proportionally. All right,
as you see, it's different arguments, and no side has really been able to bring forth a definitive argument either in favor or against.
Yeah, I love this. Okay, Marco, hold on. We are going to the second and last break. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now, streaming live on youtube.com/Mystic Lounge. If you enjoyed the show, please jump on over to YouTube, support us in this channel, like, comment, and subscribe. And I will get to Charles' question regarding the graffiti, because I'm not ready to let that one go either, Charles. We're right there with each other. We'll be right back. This is Alan B. Smith. I will see you on the inverted upside down.
Tell me why, with 12 sides, the odds are that we die, roll the die. As you hide, I can't find you on the other side of the line.
This coffee is delicious. Is that a UFO? I'm actually seeing a UFO. This coffee is awesome. That's why they call it alien coffee bean. Is this even made on Earth? Hey all, Paranormal Now will be syndicated on the UnX network, the new mainstream, where you can find your favorite hosts and shows on the cutting edge of ufological and paranormal news and topics. Listen for Paranormal Now rebroadcast on the X at 2 a.m. EST Fridays, 11 p.m. PST Thursdays at unxnetwork.com.
On and again, the signs keep on coming, they point to the end, but I hold on so tight.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time, and hopefully a little bit more into the deep seas, because we really haven't spoken much of the seafaring aspects of this grand culture and civilization called Atlantis. But Marco, before we do continue down that line of inquiry, I am curious. Marco made Charles commented on a question that I was going to follow up with, which was, I do remember in the news there were apparently German scientists that it's
Yes, trespassers.
If you sure, hey, they're rogue, right? Rogue scientists.
Yeah.
And the testing that they did suggested that the markings
Was faked.
of Khufu
Yeah.
were from a later. How can you trust them? And two, do you think that that's true?
It's possible. It's possible. So I think it's Scott Creighton wrote a beautiful book about the whole question of the supposed forgery of the graffiti inside the Great Pyramid. I think he has some very valid arguments for that. However, as it comes to the question of these dating that was done on a sample of paint, it's not evidence will be accepted in any court of law. So because the sample was not acquired legally, so the right question to ask is why have Egyptian authorities not carried out any dating of the pigments of the graffiti? That's to me the right question to ask. But again, I go back to my idea. I think that the number of the graffiti suggests that it's very unlikely that they would all be forgeries. I think some of these graffitis may be authentic, but again, that only proves, that only shows, even if they are authentic, that less than 1/3 of the volume of the pyramid was built at the time of Khufu. So you have to think that because of the height at which these graffiti are found in these relief chambers, construction of the pyramid had already progressed by over 70%. So the volume of the pyramid that is below the level of the king's chamber includes over 2/3 of the total mass of the pyramid already that already existed. And there are some very interesting inconsistencies. So if you look at the quality of construction of the king's chamber, it's probably one of the worst constructed rooms or spaces inside the entire Great Pyramid. It's very sloppy construction, and this is a paradox. Between the stone blocks, they were wonderfully carved. They show evidence of very precision cuts on the granite. Their assembly, however, was extremely poor. There is actually more difference in the level of the walls of the King Chamber than there is over the entire perimeter, of the entire base of the Great Pyramid. There is evidence that some of the beams of the roof cracked. So it's all evidence that suggests to me like a much sloppier and less accurate construction, as if an entirely different civilization built that chamber than the rest of the pyramid. So to me, the possibility that those or even if it could be demonstrated that those graffiti were actually carved or painted better during the time of Khufu, that only shows that that part of the pyramid was created around the time of Khufu, probably using stone blocks and materials that were already there. But that at least would explain the difference in the quality of construction that one finds in the upper portions of the pyramid compared to the foundation courses.
Yeah, it would. And so what do you think is the complete timeline, guesstimation, of all these different phases, start to finish?
But I would say it probably spanned. What I also suggest is that construction of the pyramid started during what they call the Neo-Atlantean period, immediately after the Younger Dryas cataclysm. There was a time period in which Atlantean civilization attempted to rebuild itself. It was a time in which you see almost a global reconstruction of Atlantean civilization. However, construction stopped probably around 9600 BC when a second cataclysm occurred at the time when Plato also situates the sinking of Atlantis. By then, I do believe that the Great Pyramid was probably 50% or more complete, probably up to the level of the King's Chamber, and construction was abandoned at that point. It very likely resumed with much poorer technology and without, of course, like the technology, the knowledge of the earlier builders during the dynastic period at the time of Khufu, and that's when the Great Pyramid was actually completed.
So that's a large gap.
That's a very large gap, and that's, I think, part of the mystery in a way that we face about the seeming disappearance and reappearance of Atlantean civilization.
Well, here's the thing, Marco. It's on the one hand, I imagine the Egyptians today are thinking, okay, so maybe we don't test this ink, this so-called graffiti, because what if it is forged, right? and it wasn't from that period, then, oh my gosh, that means that these people that we consider to be our descendants, or our ancestors that we had descended from, it wasn't them. And
well, not really.
Perhaps that cuts into the pride of...
For sure. For sure. I don't think that even if we're able to demonstrate that graffiti were forged, that will really change anything in the Egyptological perception, because that's only one, let's say, piece of evidence. I'm sure they would argue that, yes, the graffiti were forged, but still the pyramid was clearly built by King Khufu, even if we cannot really demonstrate that.
They'll still make
the argument. They will still make the argument, exactly. I think, but I want to go back to...
On the other hand, Marco, I'm sorry. On the other hand, wouldn't they want to embrace that they are descendants of Atlanteans instead?
Well, in a way, I think
that's pretty cool,
Yeah, and I want to go back to your question, like, how do you explain this time difference? Like, you have a construction that was probably started and then abandoned, and you have construction like resuming at the site thousands of years later. So how do you explain that? And I think if you look at the very myths and the creation stories of the ancient Egyptian, they suggest that their ancestors, they came from a land in the west, and what they also suggest in the book is that this was not a point in time episode. It was not just a single migration to Egypt, but there were different waves of migrations. There was certainly a first wave of migration towards the end of the last ice age at the time of the Younger Dryas. So when you have the first flourishing of Egyptian civilization, then this culture that they call Neo-Atlantean disappeared for a number of different reasons, among those climate change, population pressures, and that left a time period of probably thousands of years in which civilization essentially went back to the Stone Age in Egypt, up until a second migration from Atlantis took place around 3000 BC. And this is what marks the beginning of the dynastic period in Egypt. So what they suggest is that what we call the dynastic Egyptian were in fact part of a second migration from Atlantis. And this is a very important point in my book about the idea that even the sinking, and I know we're going to talk about that, the sinking of Atlantis was not a single point in time episode. It spanned thousands and thousands of years. And so, of course, you have major episodes of sinking, like the one that occurred at the end of the last ice age. But there is evidence that a significant portion of the Atlantean landmass was still above water, probably as late as the European Bronze Age. And it was shows the gradual sinking of Atlantis throughout the Neolithic and the Bronze Age period that triggered a number of migrations from Atlantis to the Old World, to the Western European Atlantic seaboard, to Egypt, as well as to Mesoamerica. And that explains why you have different, almost like different phases or different waves of civilization. It's quite natural that these new immigrants, in a way, would resume the work of their ancestors. They will pick it up from where they had left. They may have even been able to access documents. There's this idea of several halls of records that are created as repositories of Atlantean knowledge. And so it's quite possible that these Atlantean survivors would have once again rediscovered these halls of records, acquired the technology, the scientific know-how to continue in these great construction projects.
During these phases, would you consider them more immigrants or refugees?
Well, I think it's a subtle distinction.
Immigrants, maybe. Yeah.
There is evidence that at least as we talk about the second wave of immigration, we are talking about violent conquest, whereas the first wave of Atlantean colonization seems to have been generally Pacific. Because at that time, we're talking about the time immediately after the Younger Dryas cataclysm, you have this idea of these very advanced beings that came and brought with them superior science and civilization, the gifts of agriculture, in a world that had been ravaged by cataclysm. And that's where you find the sudden emergence of agriculture around the world. That's why these people were worshipped as gods, because they brought civilization to what was essentially a world that still existed, that still lived in the Stone Age. But now when you fast forward to 3000 BC, then you have a very different picture. You already have lands and territories that were fairly densely populated by Neolithic populations, by farmers that already lived in this area. For instance, in Egypt, it can be shown, archaeological research shows that a civilization existing in Egypt, the pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization, the Nakada culture, and at some point this entire civilization was violently replaced by what we call the dynastic Egyptians that created all that we know today as Egyptian civilization. So there is an idea of yes, immigration, but also violent conquest at some point. So that's why the narrative may also be charged with political implications as well. So you're not talking in this case about the ancestors of the ancient Egyptian, but almost a colonial power that came, established itself in the land. And by the way, there is also evidence in Egypt that this civilization was not long-lived, at least if we talk about the old kingdom of Egyptian civilization, which is almost its separate time period within the frame of Egyptian civilization that also ended in what is called the first intermediate period, which we witness a period of chaos and anarchy in which royal authority was overturned. So there's almost a sense that because of this like oppression in a way, because that was perceived as a sort of oppressive regime that forced and enslaved in a way the local population, forcing them to build these great monuments and constructions. It's so much depleted the resources of the country that created the potential for a massive insurrection, for actually overthrowing that regime, which is exactly what we find in Egypt with the collapse of the Old Kingdom. There is
this sort of diaspora of Atlanteans. Now, when someone has to, emigrate into a new zone for, financial reasons, but most likely cataclysmic reasons, or their society is breaking down, war, whatever it is, in order for those people to kind of build a simulacra of Atlantis, I would imagine that you would have to have enough of those people, a large enough group, where the collective shared knowledge, so that you have that enough knowledge to rebuild and redesign. but also, the human power, the physical power, the
Mhm.
numbers to actually do the work. I can't imagine a band of 200 people landing,
Mhm.
in South America, and then suddenly, boom, there's this, you know, amazing civilization with,
Well,
archaeological.
you have precedents for that. Now, if you think about the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica, the conquest of the Aztec Empire was accomplished by a group of probably a couple hundred Spaniards that conquered this empire of millions. So, um,
That's true, but you did have the resource coming
right.
from the the Spain,
Mhm.
sending gold and money
Sure.
and then more weapons and more people, and yeah.
I think that's part of the frailty of all these multiple attempts. And I think there were like multiple attempts throughout history at reconstructing, rebuilding Atlantean
Hmm.
civilization. But all these attempts were undermined by the fundamental fact that these colonists were very few in number. So long as their technological advantage could be maintained over the rest of the population, they could establish a very strict rule. So that was, of course, much easier during the Neolithic period when they came with these far superior technology. But then over time, their technological advantage disappeared. They could no longer replace that technology, the machines, the let's say like all the like great inventions they may have brought
Hmm.
from their homeland.
And they have to bring enough.
Right, they had to bring enough and they had to be able to replace them. So, in a way, with the collapse and the disappearance of the Atlantean heartland, they also lost an entire technological industrial complex that produced all these artifacts. It's almost as if you think, to make another more modern analogy of the British Empire, in a way, what would have happened if all of a sudden England would have sunk in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean during the 1800s with all the British colonies? Probably, yes, for a while they would have been able to maintain a sort of simulacra of British civilization, but
Mm.
without all the industrial and the technological complex of Great Britain, they would no
Mhm.
longer have been able to replace the tools, the machines. So, as those
Yeah.
tools would were out and become useless, eventually they would have fallen back to a much more primitive level of civilization. That's when I think. That regime was overturned. That situation was no longer sustainable because you had
Mhm.
few Atlanteans or descendants of the original Atlantean colonists exerting power over a very large population. And so long as that balance
Mhm.
of power could be maintained with technology, that lasted for a while. But
So indeed, these were kind of commonwealths.
in a way, we can think they were, and I think also when you talk about the different Atlantean migrations, again, I do
Hmm.
suggest in the book that these were triggered by the subsidence of the Atlantean landmass that again spanned several thousands of years. So, as these cataclysms affected the motherland of Atlantis,
Hmm.
probably thousands of peoples were forced to migrate. That's where when you find these waves of migration, both to Europe as well as to the Americas, to the New World. And this process lasted well into the European Bronze Age. Actually, the last episode of mass exodus from Atlantis happened around 1200 BC, at the time of the Sea Peoples invasion, where you have this
Huh.
massive migration of peoples into the Mediterranean, into the Middle East. But then something really interesting happens because those sea peoples were actually stopped by the civilizations, by the powers of the time, because
Hmm.
by then the technological gap was no longer that big as it had been 2,000 years earlier or
Sure.
10,000 years earlier. And so they were no longer faced with scattered bands of hunter gatherers, but with powerful empires. They were actually able to
Mhm.
chase them back and repel that invasion.
Yeah. So wouldn't there be DNA evidence
Mhm.
um, in human remains around the world to suggest that there was a commonality
Mhm.
between all these very places very far away from each other, these distant lands?
I think that's a very valid question. I do think that to some extent, genetic research can point to a common origin, let's say, of
Are you,
these.
are you saying it can or it has?
It can, and it has to some extent. Of course, you have to base this on the assumption, which I think is a big assumption, that these Atlanteans were homogeneous, at least like ethnically homogeneous people, which I think is a big assumption, is a big leap of faith, and not necessarily true. Again, if you think about Atlantean civilization more as a commonwealth of different nations, different ethnicities, then it would be really hard to pinpoint like a specific Atlantean DNA. Let's say. But even so, we have evidence from those lands where allegedly Atlantean survivors or colonists settled of some genetic markers. One example is the so-called haplogroup X. Another example is the Rh negative blood factor. Now, when you plot those on a map, you find a very interesting pattern because you find the highest frequency of both haplogroup X and the Rh negative blood factor exactly in those areas where tradition suggests that Atlantean survivors took refuge, particularly in areas of the Pyrenees, the western Atlantic seaboard of Europe, parts of North and South America, Lebanon, the Middle East, which are also curiously many of the places where you find these very remarkable megalithic structures of unknown age.
Okay, so anywhere we find those genetic anomalies, we think maybe. What about other megalithic sites in the Far East? If Atlanteans were a seafaring civilization, did they make it literally all over the globe?
Yeah, they could have. Definitely, I think there is very strong evidence of an Atlantean colonization of much of Europe, North Africa, as far as Egypt, and Mesopotamia, of South America. When you're talking about the Far East, I think that's where the picture gets a bit more complicated because there is evidence that particularly in the region of Central Asia and India, other civilizations that may have been antagonistic to the Atlanteans also developed during the time before the end of the last ice age.
Less receptive.
So
Less
yeah,
receptive.
for instance, in India, you have all these Hindu epics like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. They seem to talk about the wars that were waged by the Rama Empire of India against the Atlanteans. So there is this idea that the Atlanteans at some point attempted to extend their influence, their conquest to India, and that triggered a war with another advanced civilization that existed at that point in the Indian subcontinent. There is also evidence that another advanced civilization existed in Central Asia, in what is now the Gobi Desert, and that a war was waged by the Atlanteans against these other civilizations.
Are the Atlanteans an alternative to the ancient alien theory?
I do think that the two. Well, let me put it this way. I don't think the two theories are not necessarily incompatible. And by the way, I'm not a proponent of the ancient alien hypothesis.
But do you believe in aliens?
I do not. In abstract, I do think there may be life somewhere else in the cosmos. That yes, I do believe. I do not believe in extraterrestrial contact. Let me put it this way, or that it has happened in
there's a lot
modern ancient times.
You're an alternative researcher, and there's a lot of good evidence out there. And I'm not talking about the more out there theories, but just the very idea that UFOs have been coming around in modern times. Do you at least look at that evidence and consider it?
Well, I would ask you like a more thought-provoking question, right? What if these UFOs were not of extraterrestrial but of terrestrial origin? And what if they originated with one of the lost civilizations of prehistoric antiquity? They may still exist in some form on our planet.
So you have thought about it.
I do. I have thought about that. So
Uh,
one,
Go ahead.
one,
Yeah.
one point, however, that I think is important, and where I do not believe, let me say, that aliens built the pyramids or things like that. I think all
Sure.
these great monuments of megalithic civilization, they show very clearly they were built by human beings according to a human canon, a human standard. In a way, I think again, if we go back to this idea of the genetic evidence. I think an argument can be made that the Atlanteans represented a separate human species. This is actually something I suggest in the book. So a species different from Homo sapiens, but still a human species, maybe a different branch of the
Right. We had
human family.
So we have Homo naledi, we had
We have
Neanderthals,
Denisovans, we have a bunch of different
Denisovans.
human species. So it's
I
not,
see.
to me, outside of the realm of the possible to think that Atlanteans may have been a separate human species that evolved on a now sunken mid-Atlantic landmass.
But then wouldn't they have mass grave sites or graves of any kind? That because that's we learn a lot about older civilizations and other species by their grave sites. What they leave behind with those that have passed on, groupings of bodies together. So if it's such a huge civilization was indeed another type of human, then wouldn't the grave sites be around somewhere where we can say, oh wow, this is clearly a cousin of ours that had a large society.
Yeah, I do think that more DNA testing needs to be done. There is this whole question, for instance, about elongated skulls, and like these like mummies have been found in different parts of the world, in Peru, for instance, and they do seem to carry. So of course we're still talking about human DNA, of course, but with a level of variations from other known human populations that suggest a potential admixture. Now. Even if we think about the number of Denisovan Neanderthal skeletons that we have, the evidence is extremely limited. Like Denisovans, for instance, pretty much all the evidence that we have is limited to a little finger bone and still like very controversial part of cranium, at least like the famous dragoman. This is pretty much all that we know about Denisovans. The way we know that Denisovans existed is through the genetic evidence that they left in various existing human populations. I do think it's a pretty very similar picture in the case of Atlanteans. So we do think that Atlanteans were not only civilization, but also separate human species. It may be possible to identify the genetic traits of Atlanteans. One example will be haplogroup X, the Rh negative blood factors. In a similar way, through genetic sequencing, it may be possible to identify the genetic footprint of Atlanteans. And I do believe that more research needs to be done, more genetic testing needs to be done on some of these anomalous finds, like elongated skulls, for instance, to show whether they really belong to the same species as us, to Homo sapiens, or they were in fact members of a separate human species.
And if you're just tuning in, I'm with Marco M. Vigato, and we're talking about his book, The Empires of Atlantis. His website is marcovigato.com, and I just put the link in the comment sections. If you're curious, go check it out. So, Marco, I think that we've accepted, you and I have accepted that there's quite potentially a civilization that predates common accepted history within academia. Sure. Okay. So if we go with that and we accept that the Atlanteans go back 10 plus thousand years, something had to come before the Atlanteans. So,
Yeah.
how far back are we talking about a civilization of human beings? And I'm not talking about hominids living in in
Yeah.
trees or in the forest. I mean civilizations where they start maybe planting and agriculture or
Well, we know that anatomically modern humans have been around for well over 200,000 years, and this is constantly being pushed back in time. There is a very significant possibility that what we would consider anatomically modern humans existed already 400,000 years ago. Now, one key question I think directly connects with the question of the origins of civilization, of Atlantean civilization, is when did anatomically modern humans start developing modern human behavior? Meaning, when did they start? We knew that, like, physically they were like us, but were they also mentally like us? I think that's the key fundamental question. And the evidence suggests that something happened, like a trigger occurred at some point throughout the process of human evolution, in which our ancestors actually started developing what we would call a civilization. They started exhibiting forms of advanced thought, of an artistic sense. And this is something that appears from very early on in human history. If you look at the paintings in caves in southern France, for instance, in the Dordogne region at Lascaux, the Chauvet cave, these are astonishing works of art. These are not the product of a primitive civilization that was just out of its infancy. I don't know if you've seen pictures of, like, the depiction of horses or some of these extinct prehistoric animals in the Chauvet cave, but they are of a quality that is pretty comparable to some of the finest art of much later periods. There is actually a famous quote from Picasso, in which after visiting the Chauvet cave, he said, "Oh my God! After Chauvet, all is decadence. Those people are already perfected art to a level." So that poses the question: are we really looking at the beginning of civilization or a legacy from something that came before? Where did this civilization get this knowledge, this artistic sense? And a very similar paradox is what you find at a place like Göbekli Tepe, for instance, where you see these very remarkable stone structures. They are effectively considered the oldest monumental structures in the world that appear as if out of nowhere, with really sophisticated engineering, over 50-ton stone blocks. So you have to ask yourself the question as to where did these people come from? Where did that civilization come from? And again, I do think that the most likely explanation is that what we're seeing is just a legacy from a much older civilization. So it's a civilization that vanished.
You could make the argument that, I mean, look at our civilization within just 500 years, how much we've advanced. So maybe Göbekli Tepe, you can rewind time 400 years, and that's where the beginning of that civilization started. Technology and development and culture.
Yep.
So maybe it doesn't actually go back, crazy far, but Göbekli Tepe is proof that I was just reading recently in a book, and it was referring to Babylonia as the beginning of true human civilization. That this is
civilization began at Sumer. People used to say,
right. And I'm like, are you not paying attention to Göbekli Tepe and all these other anomalous sites? Do you think that we'll find another anomalous site?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So the thing about Göbekli Tepe is that it's clearly the most ancient, the most advanced site of its kind that we have found. But if you think about where it was found, it's an literal cultural backwater. So we're not talking about a major cultural region of the ancient world. So if this is what we find in a relatively remote site in southeastern Turkey, imagine what we could find on the ocean seafloor. So we know, for instance, that between the end of the last ice age and now, global sea levels rose by over 120 meters. So the best place where one would look for evidence of an ancient advanced civilization is obviously along the coasts. So, but all these sites are now deeply underwater; they're deeply submerged. The likelihood of us finding something like Göbekli Tepe or even more advanced than Göbekli Tepe is slim on the ocean seafloor. But there is definitely a possibility that with new technological advancements, we may actually be able to find more of these sites, and ensure that when these sites are found, they will show a much higher level of civilization than even Göbekli Tepe. Again, imagine Göbekli Tepe as a cultural backwater. If that was the cultural backwater of that civilization, where was the center of that civilization? And I do believe the center of that civilization will be found on the coasts, in places that are currently underwater.
So the theory that Crete was Atlantis, and do you think that Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization?
Well, talking about Crete, I think that's a hypothesis that was formulated in an attempt to rationalize or make up Plato's story of Atlantis more, let me say, like acceptable to the archaeological mainstream. There is literally nothing about the identification of Crete or Santorini with Atlantis that really makes sense. If you look at Plato's account, it's talking about a massive seafaring empire that spanned both sides of the Atlantic. He's talking about this huge landmass. The time frame doesn't match. So I really don't think that's really a candidate for Atlantis. And of course, like, people have a tendency of identifying pretty much every lost civilization or every sunken city with Atlantis. And certainly there have been hundreds of like sunken cities and probably dozens of lost civilization. But does it mean it's Atlantis? No. Now, talking about Mesopotamia, I think there you have one of the earliest civilization of the historical period, so very similar to dynastic Egyptian civilization. However, when you look at what these civilizations thought about their origins, where they came from, and this is a pattern you find in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in South America, what they would tell you is that the origins of their civilization stretched much farther back into prehistory. Actually, you have kings lists from Mesopotamia that go back tens of thousands of years. You have one document, which is the famous Sumerian king list, that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, or the king list of Berossus that establishes the reign of the first king of Sumer over 400,000 years ago. And these are very precise lists. So you have a belief among those ancient civilizations that their origins stretched back into very remote antiquity. And if you looked at the way they structured their chronologies, for instance, if you think about the way the ancient Egyptians thought about their prehistory, the origins of their civilization, they divided the prehistoric period into different ages. As you would have had the age of the gods, the age of the demigods, and these ages, they lasted for thousands of years. So it's almost as if modern Egyptology, modern archaeology only focused on the last 5,000 years, let's say what we call the historical period. But if you look at the documents that these civilizations left us and the way they looked at their past, the origin of their civilization, what they would tell us is that that only comprises the most recent period of their civilization, but they kept a record of kings and dynasties that stretched back thousands of years before that.
And it wasn't just their imagination. They weren't just storytelling.
Well, that's what let's say mainstream academia would tell you. They were just fairy
Mhm.
tales, right? So they were making up these fairy tales about kings and dynasties that never existed
Right.
to sort of like legitimize the rule.
Exactly.
However,
Yeah.
and this is what I find very interesting when you actually look at these documents, this king's list, you realize that these were not. Fairy tales. These are very precise documents. You have, for instance, cuneiform records from Mesopotamia that record the reigns of kings down to the years, months, and days of reign. And you have these records
Mhm.
include hundreds of kings going back into very remote prehistory. There is evidence that these documents, which, by the way, are some of the earliest documents of mankind,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
earliest redactions of the Sumerian king list, they date back to almost 3000 BC. And even then, there is evidence that these documents were copies of earlier documents. There are a number of errors, of mistakes in the transcription of these documents. There are even passages in which the scribes or the copyists, they quite literally wrote as a side note, there were parts of the text they did not understand or parts of the text that were damaged and they
And
could
Mark,
not copy them.
where can people find this? Are there resources online where people can view these documents?
Well, there are transcriptions of these texts. Now, when we talk about some of the most important like sources on Mesopotamian
Hmm.
prehistory, these ancient kings list, you have the Weld Blundell Prisma, several of the Nippur tablets that were found at the Royal Library of Nippur, and there are like translations, various editions of those that have been published, mostly in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I provide like many of the references for these original texts in the bibliography of my book as well.
So
When you're talking about
go ahead.
when you're talking about Egypt, for instance, there are a
Yeah.
variety of documents. It's very interesting, like the selective approach that Egyptologists take. So one of the fundamental documents about Egyptian history is the Turin Papyrus. It's a papyrus that is presently on exhibit in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, in Italy, but it was found in Thebes, in Egypt in the late 1800s. It contains two sections. There is one section that covers the kings of the historical period. And that's pretty much the key document for a reconstruction of Egyptian history. So our whole sequence of Egyptian dynasty, the sequence of kings, it's almost entirely based on the Turin Papyrus and a handful of other documents. What Egyptologists ignore deliberately is that on the other side of the papyrus, we have the record of the kings that came before the historical period, of the prehistoric kings. And it's a list that goes back 30,000 years. So there is a list of kings that stretches back into prehistory with dynasties of kings.
Yeah.
There is no separation really. So for the ancient Egyptians, it was the same. It was just different dynasties. It
Can I can
just
I make can I make an argument in defense?
mhm.
And
Yeah.
that is, if you need to create a lineage to justify
Mhm.
your existence, I mean, do you really need to go through the effort of 30,000 years?
Yeah.
I think that seems a little bit overkill.
Yeah.
I don't know what ancient thoughts were like back then, but wow, that's it.
Yeah.
And you're saying that some of the descriptions that go along with these periods of time where they're noting these kings, the descriptions correlate with weather or climate.
They were extremely accurate, so they correlate with astronomical phenomena.
That's
They go
amazing.
down to recording eclipses, for instance. So these are very accurate calculations. It's really hard to make an argument that these are just made up
Well,
fairy tales.
well, that's what drives me nuts because I'm listening to you,
Mhm.
and okay, I'm assuming that all this is true, the evidence that you're presenting, right? And it sounds pretty darn convincing. So why is it so difficult
Well,
for me?
what
I mean, honestly, like what's going to happen? Are people going to lose their jobs? Is society going to crash? I just don't get it.
Well, what the mainstream archaeologists and Egyptologists would tell you is that, well, show me the evidence. And if these kings existed 30,000 years ago, where are like show me the
Well,
pot shards?
Right. Well,
basically.
show me the evidence of Neanderthal,
Mhm.
right? I mean, you're,
Right,
it's
right,
very limited. I mean, how many bones do we have?
right. And
And sometimes recently, like, what was it? The Naledi,
mhm. Yep.
the original bone, I think, was like a thumb. It started with
Yes.
like
Yes.
a thumb, and they're like, oh, a new a new species of human. If that's all you have to work with, I mean, my gosh, how could you be so
Right.
critical? Yeah,
And to me, it's not that the evidence does not exist. It's that nobody's even looking for the evidence. It's almost
right.
like they're starting with this mindset that this is impossible. We're not going to find anything, and so we're not
Mhm.
even going to look for that evidence. So it's almost as if when you're conducting an archaeological excavation, you reach at some point you reach a certain layer of your excavation when you reach the level
Mhm.
of let's say like the earlier cultures of the late Neolithic or the early Bronze Age, and you're said that's fine. There's going to be nothing else below, so you don't even make the effort to see if there is like an earlier layer of occupation. You just start with the assumption that there was nothing before that, and
I
that's why
find
it
it
took
so
so long
strange.
to
Yeah.
recognize a site like Göbekli Tepe. I think this is incredible if you think about that. But when
Mhm.
Göbekli Tepe was first excavated, and that happened in the 1960s, so decades before its importance was recognized, the archaeologists that were in charge of the excavation of the site, they
Yeah.
first thought it was a Byzantine cemetery. Imagine a Byzantine cemetery. Then when they conducted some more in-depth excavation, they looked at the carvings. They actually saw some of the pillars exposed with the carvings. So they said maybe the style looks like a Bronze Age, right? It's something
Mhm.
similar to what you find in the Hittite period. So maybe it's late Bronze Age, but that's it. We have hundreds of sites from the Bronze Age. Nothing really
Mhm.
interesting, nothing to see here. Until Klaus Schmidt, who was actually became famous as the discoverer of Göbekli Tepe, even though he was not really the discoverer of the
The
site.
original. Yeah.
In the 1990s, I actually started to dig deeper. He was an expert in
Mhm.
prehistoric sites. And he actually said, look, there is something wrong here. This is not a Bronze Age site. This is much, much earlier. And imagine the
Yeah.
shock when the first dates came in. Turned out it was neither a Byzantine cemetery nor a Bronze Age site. It was literally 10,000 years old. And imagine how many other sites like Göbekli Tepe exist out there where nobody has ever conducted excavation because they just think it's impossible that these
Well,
sites would be that old.
if they think it's impossible on the dry ground, imagine
Imagine
there's
underwater, for sure.
underwater. Like, there's no
Yeah,
way they're gonna get funding from the university
right.
to look for
What are
that,
you
right?
looking for? You're just going to find like a few broken spearheads or something like
Yeah.
that. There is no point
Yeah.
in even looking, right?
Mhm.
So that
So
becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. If you're not looking for the evidence, you're never going to find.
yeah, so people use the Olmecs as an example of a potential different race of humans traveling to South America, simply because of the way they look, because of the carvings, right? And there have been some, I believe, genetic anomalies in some of remains that were found in South America that were from either Asia or Africa, perhaps. I'm not sure. Do you think that the Polynesians were indeed a worldwide seafaring culture? And if so, were they somehow descendants of the Atlanteans?
Well, let me just correct you maybe on the question of the Olmecs.
Hmm.
I think there has been lots of speculation on the
Sure.
possibility the Olmecs may have come from Africa, for instance. But this
Hmm.
is actually one case in which genetic research has been conducted, and it shows beyond a doubt that the Olmecs were of actual Amerindian origin. So, no, of course, like it's still relatively limited sample, but there is nothing in the
Hmm.
genetic evidence to show that the Olmecs had a different genetic ancestry. And actually, there is a pretty strong resemblance between like the Olmec heads and some of the modern living populations in the area of the Gulf Coast of Mexico. I do think, however, there are many examples across the across Mesoamerica and South America as well, of populations that show genetic traits that would have set them apart from the rest of the Amerindian populations. One of those examples is the case of the elongated skulls, for instance, from various cemeteries in Peru. There is evidence also from the accounts of the very Spanish conquistadors that ancient Mesoamerica and South America was much more of a ethnic and cultural melting pot than we would be inclined to believe. And even recently, since you mentioned the Polynesians, for instance, there's been genetic testing conducted on various skeletons from both Polynesia and South America that shows that beyond a doubt, transoceanic contact took place between South America and Polynesia in ancient times. Now, it's still debated which way the contact went. It was probably both ways.
Okay, interesting.
But the reality is that it's very clear that the Polynesians were one of the great seafaring cultures of antiquity and even of modern times. Just the way they colonized hundreds, even thousands of islands, often separated by hundreds of miles of open sea, is really a testament to their seafaring skills. So I think it's a little naive from our side to think that over the course of thousands of years there was basically no contact between these cultures of the ancient world and in South America.
Do we have a chance to make it past that hump, whatever that is, that Atlantis was faced with, that led to the end of their civilization? Are we doomed to go down the same path?
Well, I think that, of course, there are patterns in history. So in a way, you may think that our own civilization is walking down the same path as Atlantean civilization, at least if you stick to Plato's account of this great and mighty civilization that lost sight of its spiritual roots and fell into materialism and decadence. That seems like very much a very fitting description of our own society, of our own civilization. However, I do believe that there is hope, because even though there are certainly like cycles and patterns in history, we're not forced to repeat history, and we also have the accumulated knowledge of the past. And that's the reason why I think it's even more important that we uncover the legacy of Atlantean civilization. I do believe that we are truly at the edge of a new golden age, of a new renaissance, in a way. If you think about what the rediscovery of the classical heritage of Greece and Rome brought to Europe during the Renaissance, imagine what the rediscovery of Atlantean science, of Atlantean technology could do for our civilization, and bring also these new awareness of our role, of our place in history and the universe.
I don't know how far we can advance. I mean, we're still at a point where Northern and Southern Italians can't decide who's better. So we have a long way to go, I think, as a culture. But Marco, thank you so much for joining tonight. I really do appreciate it, and I appreciate your mind and your obvious deep dedication to study and research. And with that said, I know, before the show we were speaking briefly, you will hopefully have a follow-up to the Empires of Atlantis. Knowing you now and having had this conversation and the work that you do, I would suggest that when that time comes in the future and you could care less, maybe take a deep dive into UFOs, and do it your way. I will, because I'd really like to see what kind of conclusions you come to.
Don't get me wrong, that's a really fascinating subject to me. I've been very, very interested, but I think at least personally, I'm more inclined to look at the terrestrial explanation of the phenomenon than an extraterrestrial. But I'm very happy to be convinced.
Yeah. Well, you're the one that brought up the subterranean, so that is terrestrial, right?
That is.
It is. Okay. All right. Thank you, Marco. I really appreciate it. I do, and I hope you'll come back on the show again in the future. If you want to find out more about Marco's book, please go to marcovigato.com. His work is Empires of Atlantis. And Marco, if you can leave us with one thought, what would it be?
Well, I think once again, I think the evidence for many things, including ancient advanced civilizations, quite literally out there. So it's part of our responsibility to actually go out and uncover that. And at least in my personal work, that's what I'm trying to do. Is really like to not only elaborate like theories and hypotheses, but really go out on the field to try to validate that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Alan.
All right. And thank you all for chiming in tonight with your comments and questions. I really do appreciate that. If you appreciated tonight's show and all shows on the youtube.com Mystic Lounge channel, please like, comment down below, subscribe. Subscribing really is an enormous help with helping this channel and the podcast grow ultimately. So thank you so much for all that you do, and any shares and likes on top of the subscriptions, all the better. Tonight was one of my favorites in a long time, and I think that what we do here and your participation and guests like Marco helps to continue a dissemination of a conversation with the greater public. And if you can learn something to support, take a few facts, put them in your pocket. So when you have a conversation with friends and family, whether it's Atlantis or whether it's UFOs, you can bring it up and you can make a sensible argument for what they might otherwise consider an outrageous topic. And little by little, we will change the landscape. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now, rebroadcast on the UnX network at 2 a.m. Eastern on Fridays. Until next time, everyone, peace and love. And as always, live in the mystery.